Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Maritime Lebanon webinar, organized by the International Center for Migration Policy Development in close cooperation with the World Maritime University. The webinar is expected to last for just over 2 hours. Its aim is to generate an academic and reality-rooted debate on what role Lebanon, as a coastal country and nation set on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, could or should define for itself, and how the international community, universities, the business community, environmentalists, conservationists, city and coastal planners, youths, and so many others have to say on maritime Lebanon as a new target, a new dream, and hopefully not a lame wish. My name is Arif Fakhri. I'm Associate Professor at the World Maritime University, and I shall be the moderator of this event. The year 2020 was a watershed for Lebanon, not just because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also because it coincided with the 100th anniversary of the State of Greater Lebanon, which is the immediate predecessor of the current Lebanese Republic, and a devastating and crippling explosion on the 4th of August at the heart of Lebanon's maritime hub, in the port of Beirut, the country's capital city. Lebanon's marriage with the sea is as old as the Bible, which is the derivative name of one of its most picturesque coastal cities. It is claimed that the name Byblos is a deformation from the Greek papyrus, which grew abundantly on the banks of the River Nile. Lebanon exported wood and other commodities to Egypt, which traded back with paper, the food for thought. In 1851, a European traveler, Gérard de Nerval, recounted in a sublime piece of literature, Voyage to the Orient, his extraordinary encounter with the Bay of Beirut, which plunged him, coming from the sea, in an idyllic dream of an alpine Swiss lake. Those were the times of pristine shores and rolling green mountains. On the 6th of March 1948, Lebanon co-founded the International Maritime Organization in Geneva. In the period 1965 to 1974, Lebanon witnessed a mean gross domestic product growth rate of plus 5.8%. The country was arguably coasting on a good model. In its early years, the Lebanese Republic prided itself with a set of maritime laws which were iconic. Judicial pronouncements in maritime law from the Lebanese courts were highly regarded in the international maritime community. But things were potentially doomed. Right from the start of the devastating 1975-1990 war, gross domestic product slumped to a mean negative growth rate of minus 4.5 per year. Over the subsequent decades and leading up to today, Lebanon would gradually be overtaken by new regional maritime hubs. Its exiguous coastline would undergo overwhelming encroachment from coastal development and large-scale environmental deterioration. Today, several dumps litter the Lebanese coast. Sewage is released untreated at sea. To temper these apocalyptic notes, the country is eyeing the prospect of massive reserves of oil and gas located in its seabed, but no drilling has commenced yet. In its report, Reforming and Rebuilding Lebanon's Port Sector, Lessons from Global Best Practices, released in December 2020, the World Bank highlights the fact that despite being endowed with a prime hub location in the Levant, the maritime sector of Lebanon failed in its key role as an enabler of economic development in the country. One could add that it failed in its key role as an enabler of social development and sustainable development. The World Bank report goes on to say that failures are a direct result of the current governance framework of the Port of Beirut. I emphasize the words current governance framework. This webinar will shed light on international maritime governance best practices and legal framework, Lebanon's national maritime regime, infrastructure and operation, case studies on maritime governance and cooperation. Our program has three main parts. We will first hear short inaugural speeches. This will be followed by the core part of the webinar, consisting of the expert presentations and the discussion. The closing session will include a summary of the webinar. Comments and questions from the audience are welcome at any stage in the chat box of the WebEx application. We will select those that can be answered by panelists during the discussion period, right after the expert presentations. To begin with, let me invite Mr. Ryan Neeland, Head of the Operations Section, Governance and Security at the European Union Delegation to Lebanon, to deliver an introductory note to the webinar. Mr. Neeland.
Thank you, Dr. Fakhri, and good morning to all of you, or wherever you are, good morning or good afternoon. On behalf of the EU delegation to Lebanon, I'm very pleased to announce the first activity in a series of webinars on Lebanon's maritime domain, an area which occupies a central place in the EU's IBM Lebanon program, as well as Lebanon's own national priorities. We are pleased to be in a position to support Lebanon in this domain, and the activity at hand provides a solid basis for more like-minded initiatives in the future. As you are aware, Lebanon's strategic location at the heart of the Mediterranean region and the importance of its commercial ports as key trade links from Europe to the rest of the Arab region place maritime governance at the center of any discussion on a comprehensive national development effort in the future. This holds particularly true in the context of Lebanon's anticipated recovery initiatives in the wake of the economic crisis that erupted here in 2019, which has been further exacerbated by the global COVID pandemic and by the devastating Beirut port explosion in August last year. The EU-funded project Strengthening Capability for Integrated Border Management in Lebanon, IBM Lebanon 3, placed a significant focus on technical assistance for the development and advocacy of a national integrated maritime policy. Therefore, the Maritime Lebanon webinar aims to support these efforts by highlighting the legacy, the relevance, and future potential of Lebanon as a maritime hub in the Mediterranean basin, and by providing an overview of Lebanon's national maritime regime, its infrastructure and operations, and its international maritime governance, best practice and legal frameworks. So it will also shed some light on empirical evidence in this domain in Lebanon by presenting case studies in the third and final session of the webinar. I take this opportunity to thank the World Maritime University for its valuable cooperation with the IBM Lebanon project. This webinar is being held with the direct cooperation of the WMU. I also wish to thank our colleagues of the ICMPD team for the design and coordination of these activities. I extend my final thanks and gratitude to our esteemed speakers in advance, and I look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neeland. I now turn to Mr. Adrian Cooper, head of the ICMPD office, to deliver his introductory note. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Doctor. Dear colleagues, dear friends, on behalf of the ICMPD, let me also welcome you to this webinar, which focuses on the maritime aspects of Lebanon. As already highlighted by Mr. Neeland, the project Strengthening Capability for Integrated Border Management in Lebanon is an example of EU-Lebanese cooperation that promotes national security and regional stability. It builds on and complements other such EU-Lebanese efforts, continuing the essential cooperation between the security agencies and beyond. ICMPD is the implementer of the EU IBM Lebanon Phase 3 project, and with the very strong support of the EU, ultimately aims to promote effective, efficient and coordinated border management in Lebanon, including within its maritime domain. Perhaps not all of you are familiar with ICMPD, who we are, what we do. In a nutshell, the International Center for Migration Policy Development is an international organization with 18 member states and active in more than 90 countries worldwide. We embrace a holistic approach to our work in order to create efficient cooperation and partnerships along migration routes. Complementing our technical assistance, ICMPD also operates as an objective and fair-minded companion in migration discourses, bringing all important players around the same table to discuss and find effective ways forward. Today's event is an example of one such activity. I would like to highlight that ICMPD has been working in Lebanon for well over a decade now. This particular project is just one of the many actions we've been dealing with throughout those years. And for many of us, our home is just a workplace, and we like our home. So we have even more motivation to do what we can to make this beautiful country better. In closing, I would like to thank the World Maritime University for its valuable cooperation and expertise, and hope that this is just the beginning of a much longer collaboration in the future. I would also like to thank the European Union delegation, represented by Ms. Neeland, and extend my gratitude to all of our speakers in advance, and of course to you, the audience. I'm sure we will have a very, very fruitful and interesting discussion today. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cooper. We should now be able to proceed with the expert presentations. We have three carefully chosen high-level experts that have very kindly accepted to deliver their perspectives on the core content of this webinar. I turn to the first speaker. Dr. Jens Uwe Schröder-Hinrichs is a professor and the Vice President, Academic Affairs of the Sweden-based World Maritime University, WMU, which is founded by the International Maritime Organization, IMO, the UN's prime specialized agency dedicated to shipping. Dr. Schröder-Hinrichs is an internationally recognized expert in the field of maritime risk and safety, accident causation modeling, maritime higher education, and capacity building. He oversees and directs the development of the academic agenda and research activities of WMU to strengthen the university's academic profile and status as the global center of excellence in maritime and ocean education, research, and capacity building. With his extensive academic experience and seafaring background, Dr. Schröder-Hinrichs maintains active links and collaborations with the maritime industry, maritime and education institutions, as well as the seafaring communities and policy-making authorities across the globe. Vice President Schröder-Hinrichs will address best practices and the legal framework of international maritime governance. Vice President Schröder-Hinrichs, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my presentation to work. I'm sorry for that. I don't use this software here normally, so now I'm a bit stuck here because it tells me that my computer has to give all kinds of security.
No worries. We are on time, so we're not going to be penalized by any loss of time.
Well, it tells me that I have to start my computer once more before I can share my screen. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what to do at the moment here.
But that's fine, perhaps. If I think we can do that, perhaps.
All right. I'm sorry for that. That's
sorry for that.
Yeah, we should have tested it probably earlier. Okay, I'll try to get back to the session as quick as possible.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience, dear audience and speakers. Okay. I am being asked by the organizers to proceed with the following speaker, pending the joining in of President Schröder-Henrichs. Can I ask the second speaker, Professor Manal Nader, if he would be in a position to start his presentation?
Yes, sure. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Of course, Arif.
Sure. Thank you for that. And just to make sure that you can perhaps share your presentation. In the meantime, let me just introduce our second speaker, Dr. Manal Nader, Director of the Institute of the Environment at the University of Balamand, which is based on the northern coast of Lebanon. Dr. Nader has a Bachelor of Science in Fisheries and Wildlife Management from the University of Minnesota, a Master of Science in Aquaculture from the University of Stirling, Scotland, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Marine Biology and Aquaculture from Hokkaido University in Japan. Dr. Nader joined the University of Balamand in Lebanon in 2000, where he led on the establishment of the Institute of the Environment and the Marine and Coastal Resources Program at the Institute. He's currently directing both. He's an associate professor at the faculty, where he teaches several undergraduate and graduate courses related to fisheries, marine ecology, coastal zone management, and general environmental sciences. Dr. Nader will address Lebanon's national maritime regime, infrastructure, and operation. It is a pleasure to give you the floor, Dr. Nader. And I see that Professor Schröder-Henrichs is back in the room, but just for your information, Jens, we are going to proceed with the second presentation and just come back to you after this. Thank you. Dr. Nader?
Thank you very much, Arif, and thank you for the opportunity to present Lebanon's national maritime regime in such a great workshop, such an important one. So, if we are to start with the Lebanese coast, we see that the Lebanese coast actually stretches 220 kilometers along a north-south axis. It has a very narrow continental shelf, as you can tell from the map that you have. It has few bays, headlands, and river deltas. 80% of the shoreline is rocky, and 20% of the shoreline is sandy. Waves tend to be strongest in January and March, affecting the coastline, leading to erosion and coastal flooding. Our offshore currents have a direction in a northeastern direction, while our eddy currents on the coastal area go into a clockwise direction. As you can tell also that right after the continental shelf, we have very steep continental slopes, and the continental slope, this is where we have very, very important deep sea canyons. In terms of the maritime boundaries of Lebanon, Lebanon adhered to the 1982 UNCLOS Convention. And in 1994, under Law 295, it actually delineated its boundaries according to the UNCLOS. And these definitions are all, for people who are familiar with this, are based on, first of all, delineating or drawing your baseline, then identifying your territorial seas, Then you go into what's called the contiguous zone, which is approximately 12 nautical miles out. Then, of course, the EEZ, or the exclusive economic zone. Now, in Lebanon also, we have a very important law that determines the maritime public domain. This was declared in 1925 by the High Commissioner under Decision 144. And the public domain, more specifically the maritime public domain, includes the shore till the waves, the highest wave mark in winter. And it actually covers all sandy and pebble beaches, bays, and salted lakes directly connected with the sea. But on top of this, the law also covered the public domain in general, where it also included protected domains like rivers, underground rivers and waters, springs, river shores, lakes, waterfalls, all of these that can be used in power production or navigation routes, dams, and in addition to others. As where we are today, we see on the map that you have on your right-hand side that Lebanon actually was able in 2007 to reach a border agreement for its economic zone with Cyprus. Nevertheless, the southern border left to negotiations. The southern border with Israel or occupied Palestine was left for negotiations. Cyprus ratified the agreement, but unfortunately Lebanon didn't. Another problem we have is in the north with Lebanon and Syria, where they did not complete the demarcation of their land nor their maritime borders. And in the past months, the issue of the northern maritime border is being discussed, given the gas and oil reserves that are supposed to be discovered there. And since 2011, you see that there's a tripartite committee that is negotiating our EEZ boundaries with Israel. And you can tell from this map the areas that are in contention between all three nations, well, between Lebanon and Syria in the north, and between Lebanon and Israel/occupied Palestine in the south. And we are looking forward for Lebanon to ratify its agreement with Cyprus. As for the legal system in Lebanon, it's a hierarchical structure. The highest of the pyramid are our international conventions and treaties that are signed by the government. Then our supreme law is the Constitution, and under the Constitution, we have laws, decrees, decisions, and notes and circulars. Laws are passed by Parliament, while legislative decrees are issued by the Council of Ministers, and they actually rank equal to a law. Decrees, on the other hand, are also issued by the Council of Ministers, but they are decrees only and do not have the power of a law, while the decisions, etc., can be issued by ministers. And this is kind of a problematic in a sense, because ministers tend to issue decisions and ministers that come after them tend to cancel them. So keeping track of all of the decisions and how they are applied in the context of governance is a little bit challenging, to say the least. We also have, on top of these, notes and circulars that are issued by the Prime Minister or by the Minister. In terms of an institutional framework for the maritime domains, we have main actors with mandate over that domain. These include the Ministries of Environment for biodiversity, pollution, etc., as Public Works and Transport for all types of infrastructural works that are to be carried out on the maritime public domain, including shipping, etc. We have Energy and Water, we have Public Health, we have Tourism, we have the Ministry of Agriculture that is concerned with fisheries and the exploitation of natural resources. We have the Ministry of Industry, and we have the Ministry of Interior and Municipalities, who are the, the overseers, let's say, like the Interior Security Forces, etc., to actually record and stop any violations. We have the Ministry of Culture in terms of the cultural sites, the sensitive cultural sites, historical sites, and archaeological sites. On top of that, the Lebanese Army also has a mandate over the maritime public domain in terms of defense. We have the municipalities, districts, and governorates, and we have the Council of Development and Reconstruction and Port Authorities. Many of these have overlapping responsibilities, and this also creates a conflict when we are to actually do any intervention on the coastal zone, be that for conservation purposes or otherwise. In terms of international conventions, Lebanon has ratified several international treaties pertaining to the coastal zone and seawater protection. These international treaties are of utmost importance since they are the highest source of law in the country, as you can recall from the pyramid. And once Lebanon signs and ratifies a convention, in principle, it cannot enact any legislation or decree that contradicts the commitments made to the convention. The commitments and obligations, therefore, of these conventions related to the protection of the maritime public domain or the maritime domain include obligations for environmental assessments and monitoring, obligations for adopting proper economic, financial, and fiscal instruments, obligations for prevention from natural hazards or any risk affecting the coastal zone, how to deal with emergencies and hazards born at sea, the upcoming or the new climate change hazards, and of course, obligations for adopting national coastal strategies, plans, and program. I'm not going to go through all of the conventions, etc., but the main one is the Convention on Biological Diversity that was ratified in 1994 under law number 360, and the Barcelona Convention for the Protection Against Pollution in the Mediterranean Sea that was ratified in 1977 under legislation decree 126. And you have the SPA protocol, the protocol concerning cooperation preventing pollution, etc. But most importantly, one of the major interest to us is the ICZM protocol for the Mediterranean that entered into force in 2017, and where there is a draft law currently in the Ministry of Environment, with the hope that it will be sent to the Council of Ministers and then to Parliament for it to be endorsed as law. And you have all of the others. For time's sake, I will not go through them. In terms of domestic laws, we have more than 32 laws and many more associated decrees and many decisions. As you recall, the issue of decisions and circulars, etc., is difficult to track. But we have more than 32 laws that actually deal with the maritime domain. The most important also for us is the protection of the environment, which is Law 444 that was enacted in 2002. And it deals with the protection of ecosystems, including the protection of the littoral and the marine environment. More specifically, within the 244, we see that Articles 29 to 34 address the principle of protection of the coast and aquatic environment from all sources of pollution in respect of the provisions of regional and international conventions ratified by Lebanon. This law also established the principles of environmental impact assessments for all projects as a tool for planning and management. But more importantly, it published the application decree for EIAs, but SEAs, the strategic environmental assessments that were issued in 2012. It took 10 years, but they are there. And an SEA was carried out for the oil and gas sector, which actually regulates the way the sector is supposed to work in the future in terms of environmental and social responsibility. Several articles of this law still need application decrees, and many are not being implemented. If the decrees for this law are published and enacted, the coastal zone in Lebanon would be in a lot better shape, and of course, its associated biodiversity. The maritime public domain itself, like we said, it was in 1925. It includes definitions and assuring that the public domain should serve the public. And this is a big issue, as we're going to see later, from violations of the maritime public domain, legal and illegal, and the artificialization and the privatization of this domain. And this is a big fight that is undergoing to return the public domain to its rightful owners, who is the Lebanese public. So several decrees in the 1960s were also enacted to regulate the occupation of this domain. On top of this, the public domain or the laws address economic activities that are to be taken on the coastal area, like land-based activities, including all kinds of waste, agriculture, industry, land policy, maritime activities, including fisheries, aquaculture, tourism, recreational activities, infrastructure, energy facilities, ports, marinas, etc. But also we have in our domestic laws, many specific laws that address coastal ecosystems like wetlands and estuaries, marine habitats, coastal forests, and woods and dunes that are on the coastline. Now, in terms of protected areas, we have several marine protected areas. We have the Palm Island Nature Reserve that was declared in 1992, the Tyre Coastal Nature Reserve that was also declared in 1992, and recently in 2019, we have the Abbasiyya coastline in the south that was also declared as a reserve. The problem with the first two is that they were declared by a law that is taken from terrestrial reserves and does not really address marine issues in terms of an MPA, but this is being worked on through the management plans. We also have natural sites and sites of natural and or ecological importance in need for protection. These are protected by decisions of the Ministers of Environment and or Agriculture, depending about the natural site that is being addressed or talked about. Like a lot of forests are under the Ministry of Agriculture, while nature reserves are under the Ministry of Environment, etc. We also have the Offshore Petroleum Resources Law and Decree in 2017. And as I said, a strategic environmental assessment has been completed for this sector. And any type of exploration in any of the blocks that have been delineated for the oil and gas need EIAs. And in Block 4, if I recall correctly, Total has already carried its EIA that allowed it to start the first drills. So in terms of cultural sites, they are protected by the Director General of Antiquities on the Ministry of Culture. And we also have, in 2017, a law that was enacted to propose settling all illegal occupancy of public maritime property. And the next slide I'm going to show, I would really appreciate it if you recall that the Lebanese coastline is approximately 220 kilometers. So a stretch of 220 kilometers. Based on a 2012 report that was produced by the Director General of the Land and Maritime Transport at the Ministry of Public Works, we see that legal occupation of the maritime public domain has reached 2 million, approximately 500,000 square meters. Add to this, the illegal occupation of the maritime public domain is approximately 2,500,000 also. So you're talking about 5 million square meters on the coastal area on a 220 kilometer stretch of a beach that is artificialized or occupied legally or illegally, which for us, this is a huge number and a huge percentage of the coastal zone. In our department, we wanted to see what happened to the coastal zone over the years. So we conducted a study on the evolution of the coast, and we compared imagery, satellite imagery between 1962 and 2010. And what you can see is something that's really also mind-shattering or boggling, is that erosion, since it's 20% of the coastline, we have pebble and sandy beaches, was about 2.6 square kilometers through a satellite image approach or GIS. But sea filling, what is called reclamation, we don't like the word reclamation because we are not reclaiming anything when we are sea filling or when we are dumping rubble onto the coastal zone. What we are doing is creating land and destroying habitats, basically. So sea filling on this coastline was approximately 8 square kilometers. So 8 million square meters have been sea filled on a 220 kilometer coastal stretch. But another thing that's really interesting, if you look at here, the shoreline length when done by GIS, our coastline actually increases to 300 kilometers, but this probably has to do with the techniques of delineating the shoreline. As for biodiversity, the Lebanese coast is very, very rich. Just a case in point that the Mediterranean actually includes more than 7% of the biodiversity around the world. We have a lot of indigenous species and a lot of speciation due to the isolation of the Eastern Mediterranean. So we have quite an interesting biodiversity. We have more than 20 benthic biocenosis that have been identified so far. This includes coastal and deep sea sensitive sites like vermeted platforms, deep sea canyons, etc. They are rich in biodiversity and diving sites. And of course, knowing the history of Lebanon, as Dr. Fakhri actually in his introduction reminded us, that it's very rich in archaeological and cultural heritage sites that need protection. On top of this, many key freshwater sources have been identified both at sea and on the coastal zone, and these also need to be protected, or they need to be conserved given their importance in coastal productivity and food security and the well-being of the coastal communities. This said, the Lebanese maritime domain, more specifically its coastal area on top of the continental shelf, is subject to extreme stresses, specifically stresses due to drastic changes in the land cover, land use on the coastal area, uncontrolled urbanization and construction of infrastructure, exploitation of natural resources. We are a sediment-starved coastline, so erosion is a big issue. We only get sediment loading during the winter season. And after the building of the Aswan Dam, we are not getting any sand from the flooding of the Nile. So we are being starved over and over again. We have also the issues of pollution. In shipping, we have the introduction of non-indigenous species that are wreaking havoc on the biological resources that exist. There are many strategies and plans that have been developed over the past 20 years, like the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, the NBSAP, the 6th National Report to the CBD in January 2019. And what's important about the NBSAP is that it identified 13 priority areas, 18 national targets, and 91 national actions. But then there was a report produced in 2018 on the Sustainable Development Goals and how we achieve them through the CBD and the NBSAP. And this is more specifically SDG 14, which addresses life below water. So I'm just going to go very quickly. We have Lebanon's Marine Protected Area Strategy. In terms of strategy, that proposed 18 sites. Several have been declared. More are in the pipeline. We have national monitoring programs for marine biodiversity, also that is endorsed. Action plan concerning species introduction and invasives, that also is endorsed, all these at the Ministry of Environment. The first national standing network for sea turtles. The annual reports on a yearly basis. We have a report produced on marine turtles and their conservation. And of course, currently we are working on the draft Mediterranean strategy for the prevention of and response to marine pollution from ships with the REMPEC. Hopefully, we will assent to it as soon as we can. Another issue that we proposed is the East Levantine Canyons area in order to protect the canyons that we have. It is based on the Lebanon's Marine Protected Area Strategy, where we have a draft law for declaring the Deep Sea Nature Reserve at Jounieh as a nature reserve. Also, in remediation and mitigation approaches, we are deploying artificial reefs in order to mitigate the impacts on marine biodiversity. So we have one that has been deployed in Abde in 2012, and we have two that have been deployed in currently this year, 2020-21, and there's one that was deployed in the south around the Zire of Saida. We also have several draft laws in the pipeline. We hope that they get through very quickly. First one is the ICZM draft law that's based on the ICZM protocol for the Mediterranean. It has 26 articles, defines the coastal zone, and it relates, we also have articles that relate to sanctions and penalties, something that is missing or not implemented in Lebanese laws. We will be declaring very soon, hopefully in the north, Ras al-Sha'ab, North Lebanon as an MPA. We will declare the Jounieh Canyon as a deep sea nature reserve. In Mount Lebanon area, Amphi as an MPA, this is in the north, and the Byblos, that we call it Jbel or Byblos, there's an MPA that will hopefully be declared very soon over there also. And we are pushing and advocating the passing of the new fishing law, because we are still subject to the 1921 fishing law that is extremely outdated and needs to be completely scrapped and a new law passed. The challenges, I mean, by looking at all of that has been achieved and is being achieved, we would think that the future outlook is very optimistic, but all of the above remains quite challenging when placed against the background of constant political instability in Lebanon and the Middle East, more specifically Lebanon. It takes us forever to form a government, and we'll not go down this road, this issue. It's really annoying. So we also have the continuing Syrian refugee displaced crisis since 2011. It's been 10 years. We also have the new national crisis of 2020, the severe economic crisis, the political impasse, the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course the Beirut explosion that shook us all. All are testing both scientists and administrators alike to achieve set goals or to implement all of the strategies that I actually showed in this presentation. And such a chronic, complex situation represents for us the main obstacle towards fulfilling national targets and objectives. So lastly, in terms of recommendations, hopefully to stimulate some conversation, we need to ensure coordination on scientific studies, projects, and especially reports. We need to work in the field. In the past 2 or 3 years, there were large amounts of funds invested for the production of review status reports, so the same information was regurgitated in different formats. Money could have been invested better. We need to endorse, allocate funds, and implement national conservation strategies, plans, and monitoring programs for biodiversity. Ensure the implementation of the ratified international conventions by issuing applicable laws and decrees. And of course, actively support awareness and advocacy activities. More importantly, from where we stand, we need to pass draft laws, especially the draft ICZM law and strategy. And thank you. I concentrated here mostly on the legislation and frameworks related to conservation of maritime domains. I didn't address shipping and ports, etc., which the time allocated wouldn't have allowed me to do so. So thank you very much for listening, and ready to take any questions anytime we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Nader. The presentation was very rich and provided us really with the perspective that will set us off on the later discussion regarding the status quo of the Lebanese maritime domain and regime. I now turn back to Vice President Schroeder Hinrichs of World Maritime University for pressing on with the presentation that he will provide on international maritime governance, best practices, and legal framework.
Somebody has to allow me to share my screen, I guess.
Definitely. Yes. Because I think we're still seeing Professor Nader's...
You want me to stop sharing? I stopped sharing mine.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you can see my screen now.
We can see it.
Oh, excellent. Oh, that's a great achievement.
Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, and sorry for the delay in starting my presentation. Many thanks for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure for me being here today and having an opportunity and talking to you about maritime governance. It was highlighted in the introduction already what World Maritime University is, so I don't need to spend a lot of time in introducing the university once more. Let me only say this very briefly to you. World Maritime University, for those of you who are not familiar with the institution, has been set up in 1983 by the International Maritime Organization, the UN specialized agency which is responsible for measures to improve the safety and security of international shipping and to prevent pollution from ships. We were established to build global capacity in maritime and ocean fields and educate future maritime and ocean leaders, a task that's very much in line also with any sustainable development in the context of the Agenda 2030. In order to deliver on its mission, the university offers postgraduate studies and a PhD program at the headquarters in Sweden and 2 campuses in China. Furthermore, we offer a variety of online programs, mainly directed at industry practitioners to facilitate continuous professional developments. So far, we have more than 5,000 graduates forming an impressive team of maritime and ocean professionals in more than 170 countries and helping to achieve sustainable developments in maritime and ocean sectors. The university is quite unique, and if you would like to find more about us, I would like to invite you to check out our website, where you can find a lot more information about us and what we do. With this, I would like to come back to the topic of my presentation today, which is to talk about maritime governance. I would like to start actually with a quote of the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, who pointed out already a number of years ago that improving governance and improving confidence between governments and people is an essential task in today's world. And I therefore think that the presentation and this event is actually fitting very well to this particular quote. Before I go into the details, actually, I would like to start with clarifying maybe a bit more what actually is understood by governance. There are different ideas, different definitions, concepts floating around. And therefore, I think it may be helpful if we start at least to make sure that we are speaking about the same things. Governance can be understood as in one way as the way how rules, norms, and actions are structured and sustained. But on the other hand, governance can also be used as a term in order to describe processes of governing, whether undertaken by a government of a state, by a market, or by a network over a social system, and whether through the laws, norms, power, or language of an organized society. So I'm trying to capture both of these aspects, focusing on the norms and the way how they are structured, but also talking about the processes, because I believe that these two aspects are fundamental in understanding how governance is working. Let me also focus on the question, what is maritime in this context? Very often we are using maritime governance, we're using marine governance, we're also talking about ocean governance. So to be quite clear, when we are talking about marine or maritime, marine is typically used in order to look at the environmental aspect. We are looking at anything that's physically related to the ocean and the living resources within the oceans. Whereas maritime is used as a word to describe ships, shipping, shipbuilding, and their associated activities. So maritime is anything or anybody connected or related to the sea or a ship, whereas marine is actually belonging to or in the sea. Probably in a very simple way, as you could say, it depends on which side of the ship's hull one is there, whether one is outside the ship or within the ship. For anything that's within the ship, you would normally use maritime, and otherwise it's marine. However, the reason why I'm actually also bringing this up is oceans and ships are connected, and you cannot look at the two issues in isolation. And I think that creates one of the challenges that we have in marine, maritime, or ocean governance in general. Let me start with the shipping industry, because the topic of my presentation is maritime governance. If you are looking at the shipping industry, you can say that maritime transport today is by far the most important means of transportation, because this is the backbone of global trade. It has enabled globalization to a very large extent. And what we see in the maritime sector, and this was probably one of the reasons why maritime transport could basically take up this important task, is that we have more than 50,000 ships worldwide in 174 states that are all governed by one set of rules applied in a very harmonized and standardized way across the globes. This has made it possible for this industry to transfer ships easily. And also, I think the success for the industry is that it allowed for multiple stakeholder input in the sense of governance in its best way. We have the cooperation between the industry, the different government bodies, and shipping therefore has become a global industry, and it's not so much looking at national approaches anymore. And I think this basically made this industry as important as it is today. What's the legal framework to start at the structure of laws, the one aspect of governance in this respect, and how does this in principle affect the shipping industry? As I pointed out, the IMO Secretariat is working with partners, and by partners I mean the member states, but also the observers within the IMO. As an organization, more than 70 organizations are working as observers, and they basically bring in the expertise and the different points of view of all the different stakeholders in the maritime and also in the ocean sectors. We are talking about classification societies, we are talking about the insurance business, we are talking about seafarer representation, but we are also talking about representation from environmental organizations or organizations with a strong focus on environmental issues. They are all coming together in the IMO in order to decide about mandatory regulations. The core part of the IMO legal framework are mandatory conventions, and some of them have been mentioned by the previous speakers. I think as far as the shipping industry is concerned, we are looking at the major conventions like SOLAS, the safety of life at sea, the MARPOL Convention, the convention that prevents the maritime pollution, and any other convention that regulates other aspects of maritime, as for instance, seafarer qualification and so on. These mandatory regulations, they are on top of the pyramid, in order to use the picture of the previous speaker, and they cannot regulate each and every aspect in detail, and therefore, in addition, we have recommendations, unified interpretations, and good practices. So the maritime regulatory framework is actually quite rich and covers quite a wide area. So the recommendations, for instance, is anything that is non-mandatory, but is of course part of the soft law. So you cannot necessarily, that's absolutely wrong, you shouldn't ignore it, because basically it describes what would be considered good practice. And there are also many other areas where individual industry players have come up with their own interpretations of what would be a good solution for something that isn't specified in so much detail in conventions. And that's what you find in unified interpretations. And sometimes it can also be that something that's regulated by a national state is considered as good practice and is referred to in the IMO as such a specific tool. So this is, in a very brief way, the regulatory framework that the IMO provides. It will be clear, of course, when we would start, and if we had more time, we could probably highlight that in more detail. It will be clear that for a number of issues, you need specific cooperation in order to implement that, because we have different actors, and then we are relatively fast outside the core area of responsibility of a maritime administration. When we are looking at flag state duties, it is clear that the majority of those issues are regulated within the maritime administration. But then, of course, when we are looking at port state control, we are already moving out a bit from the core part of a maritime administration. And when we come to coastal state obligations, then very often you will realize that in different member states of the IMO, the responsibilities for coastal state obligations are with different organizations, different administrations. And just to mention a few other keywords here: piracy, seafarer certification, pollution, air and sea. I think some of this was highlighted in the previous presentation, and it is clear that there are different organizations in the country that take care of this. So we have one source of information in terms of legal norms, which is the IMO. But then if we are thinking about the implementation of all of this in a specific country, you will find different actors who would be involved in this. I have on this slide only tried to capture some of those in order to demonstrate that. And here we are coming probably to the second aspect of governance. It is not only the norms that are important and that you have norms, but it is important also that as part of governance, we can achieve cooperation between different organizations in order to achieve that those norms are implemented and generate the effect that were hoped to be achieved by these norms when those norms were actually designed. So within a country, we can have different ministries actually being responsible for different aspects of maritime safety, for instance, or specifically for pollution. When it comes to the implementation and also for the enforcement, there are very often shared responsibilities between, let's say, a Ministry of Transport, very often having an agency that would provide the certification of ships, But then when it comes to the enforcement, very often a Coast Guard could be involved, or a port authority, if you think about port state control, for instance. When it comes to the environmental pollution, very often you will see that there are different environmental agencies involved that could be with different ministries there. And it requires closer cooperation, especially also when we come back to the initial idea where we say a ship, yes, is a ship, but a ship more or less exists in an environment. So to look at a ship in isolation is, I would say, maybe not the best idea. So it requires the consideration of this wider context. And when we consider this wider context, then we are stepping very quickly out of the core responsibility of the IMO. And then we realize that the IMO is only one actor in terms of the development of international norms. When we are looking at the Mediterranean Sea, you may have regional agreements, for instance. And as far as even responsibilities on a ship are concerned, you have other actors as well, such as, for instance, the International Labour Organization that regulates the occupational health and safety standards on board ships. And especially since we are living in a world where environmental concerns are given more and more of a priority, there are other actors like, for instance, UNEP, which one should consider there as well. And as I highlighted before, also on a private or NGO level, different actors are coming together there as well. And the idea of governance is basically that you can try and bring all of these individual actors together in order to ensure that the norms are first of all understood and are also implemented in a specific way where they generate benefits to the maritime and ocean community. I will come back to that a little bit more in the rest of my presentation when I'm trying to discuss a bit more the aspect of processes and communication. As I mentioned before, especially when we are not only looking at ships anymore, but look at the environment in which a ship is organizing, we have many regional instruments that require implementation and action. I think this was also highlighted more specifically by the previous speaker. If we're looking at the Mediterranean, for instance, you have the Barcelona Convention that covers additional aspects that are normally not regulated in all detail by the IMO. The Mediterranean Sea, as you can see from this slide, is not an exemption. There are many regional arrangements worldwide. Here in Sweden, we are close to the Baltic Sea, and the Baltic Sea is also subject, for instance, to such a local regional arrangement, the Helsinki Convention, for instance, that focuses specifically on the environmental aspect of the Baltic Sea. We can actually say that if we leave the shipping industry at the moment and look at the oceans from a wider perspective, we have many different actors who are actually trying to do their specific business in the open sea. We have renewable energy, oil and gas activities have been mentioned by my previous speakers. We have fisheries and aquaculture. At the same time, we're trying to achieve a high level of marine protection. And in some parts of the ocean, we are even talking about the potential of seabed mining. It is clear when we are looking at this picture that this needs some kind of order in a way. And in this respect, the word ocean governance is very often used. And the specific tool that is used in ocean governance in order to ensure that all the different stakeholders can make an impact and input to the different planning considerations, we have what we call marine spatial planning. That's a regulatory process, and that's actually considered as a very good example of how governance would function in reality. And there are some clear UNESCO guidelines, for instance, on marine spatial planning. The reason why it is so important actually to find a way where the different stakeholders can communicate and raise their interest is maybe highlighted in a very good way on this particular slide, when we are looking at the claims of the spatial claims for the different purposes in Belgian waters. Belgium is a country with a relatively small coastline, and you can see here there are different actors who would like to carry out activities in the territorial waters of Belgium, fisheries, shipping, defense, sand and gravel extraction, and all of that. And the claims that have been made by these different stakeholders exceed the space in the Belgian territorial sea by 264%. So it needs some kind of regulation, some kind of balancing where you can actually make decisions about how you would like to distribute the share that's available in for the different purposes. What we see very often, especially if we are leaving the ship, then you find we have different actors in a way and different tasks. There are many instruments that still haven't been implemented on a very high level internationally. So the UN Stock Agreement, for instance, flag state performance guidelines, and so on. There's still areas of improvements, and we are facing actually legal gaps, probably more in areas outside territorial waters, but those issues are clearly there and probably still require a discussion on an international level, specifically also, as it was highlighted by the previous speaker, there are many international actors in the scene, but we see a very fragmented approach when it comes to ocean governance in this respect. There are many good efforts made at the moment, but it still requires more concentrated efforts in order to discuss this to a better end. Let me also, at the end of my presentation, probably highlight why governance is also important. I would like to refer back to an example of a quite catastrophic accident a couple of years ago, the Deepwater Horizon in 2010, an oil platform that sank in the territorial waters of the United States and caused an enormous environmental damage. Not only an environmental damage, but also a financial damage. The issue or the accident is quite characteristic for a number of issues that we are very often facing in relation to maritime governance in general. We have different actors, and if there is no good cooperation, if there is no clear lines of responsibilities, then very often you find different regulations among the different actors, which very often leads to a lack of a complete overview. And this can have some very catastrophic consequences if those actors do not coordinate their activities. On this slide, there are only a few numbers comparing the situation in 2010 prior to the accident for BP, which was the owner of the Deepwater Horizon, and after in 2030. And you can see basically that the damage for the company actually was quite significantly. So we are really talking about large amounts of money, and you can imagine this is not even considering the effect that this had on the marine environment. With this, I would like to come to an end of my short presentation. It was intended as an introductory presentation only. I'm happy to answer any further questions later on in the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice President Schröder-Hinrich. I think this presentation of yours added a very significant aspect to the build-up to our discussion in terms of the international perspective, the best practices of maritime governance. I would like us now to move on in the expert presentations to the third and last speaker. And let me introduce her briefly. Our third and final expert speaker for today's webinar is Mrs. Jihan Abi Khalil, holder of a master's degree in shipping management from London City College. Mrs. Abi Khalil is the owner and managing director of Adelmar Logistics, based in Beirut, Lebanon, since 2010. For the last 10 years, Mrs. Abi Khalil has lectured in shipping and logistics courses at reputable Lebanese universities, including the Holy Spirit University of Kaslik and the University of La Sagesse. combining both practical and academic aspects of the maritime industry. Because she truly believes in women's empowerment, Mrs. Abi Khalil recently helped establish the Lebanese branch of the Women's International Shipping and Trading Association, WISTA International, where she currently serves as a board member. Mrs. Abi Khalil will provide a presentation relating to case studies on maritime governance and cooperation. She will speak of the port of Beirut. Mrs. Abi Khalil, it is a pleasure to invite you to take the floor. And
hear me?
We can see you and I think hear you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for this introduction. I'm really glad to join you today in this webinar. So you hear me, Arif?
Yes, I can hear you. We can probably all hear you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen now.
Thank you.
Just a second. Okay, so first of all, I'm really glad that I'm joining you today in the webinar. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's all.
Okay, great. That's perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, as I said, thank you for the introduction and thank you for this opportunity. However, I will not hide my deep disappointment today, because actually 2 years ago I have given a similar speech about maritime governance at Isaac University, hoping that we can improve the governance, the maritime governance at Beirut Port. Instead, today, after 2 years, I'm discussing again the same subject. However, we're discussing how to rebuild and reconstruct Beirut Port. In addition to that, the whole shipping sector the last year have experienced, and the Lebanese citizens have experienced, the blast of Beirut Port, which led not only to physical damage, financial damage and environmental damage, but also to a serious mental damage to the citizens and to the whole shipping sector. In order to cut it short, and in order to share with the audience what the shipping sector is living on a daily basis at Beirut Port, what are the challenges and the bottlenecks facing the sector, I have decided to share with you the views of different major players in the shipping market, to share the challenges they are facing on a daily basis. Therefore, I have decided to basically transfer their views, their opinions. I have chosen two main players. The first player is a general manager of a container line in Beirut Port, and the second major player is actually a ship owner of a livestock carrier, also operating on a daily basis at Beirut Port. I have decided to ask them a few questions in relation, first of all, to the maritime governance at Beirut Port, in relation to the challenges and bottlenecks they are facing in their daily operations. I asked them about their opinion in terms of what are the actions and decisions that should be taken in the near future in order to improve the efficiency of the maritime governance in Lebanon. And of course, I couldn't not ask about their opinion about the port blast on August 4th and their comments about it. The first player, as I said, he is the general manager of a main container line, Beirut Port. He prefers to stay anonymous. He explained that, unfortunately, he doesn't believe that maritime governance exists in Lebanon because, as Dr. Joe said previously, there are no actually lines of responsibility, and therefore accountability doesn't exist. Concerning the challenges he's facing on a daily basis, he explained that one of the real examples of deception and challenges he's facing is what happened in August 4, 2020. He actually he lost a few of his employees. His office was fully damaged. She had to relocate to another office, which is the case actually of several people in Lebanon. I'm one of them because I do work at Beirut Port. In addition to that, he believes that there's a lack of management structure, and at the moment there is a committee running the port. It's a temporary committee running the port that he believes it is not efficient and it is influenced by political parties. Concerning his vision about the future, he believes that there should be actually a new sector of law that has a clear vision, and that we should ensure value for money and mobilization of the private sector in order to reconstruct and operate the port terminal, the logistics, and free zone areas. Finally, he believes that the blast is the result of overlapping of responsibilities and the lack of accountability. And he believes that the existing system doesn't really benefit the Lebanese economy, but he seeks only benefiting personal interests. At the end, he actually explained his fear that he might lose the agency of the container line at Beirut Port. The container line is actually considering omitting Beirut Port from its regular schedule. The reason for that is the non-availability of a budget for continuous maintenance at the port, and of course for the poor infrastructure. Therefore, now the container line is considering omitting Beirut Port from its regular schedule and eventually seeking other destinations, more profitable one, more stable one, with a better infrastructure to its container vessels. I'm going to now move to the second major player. It is Ms. Bisar Sleiman. She's the founder and CEO of TIA Marine Services. She's also a marine consultant and a broker. Ms. Bisar explained that she lacked trust in maritime governance in Lebanon, and she doesn't want to share her opinion about it. In addition to that, Ms. Bisar explained that as a ship owner of livestock carriers, currently they are facing serious issues with the central bank and with the government, simply because they have been subsidized by the government, and they are getting their payments quite late. The result of that will be that they will diminish their vessels' calls to Beirut Port. They will consider other destinations as long-term strategy. And the problem about that is that eventually this will have a negative impact on the food market in Lebanon, because there will be a reduction of livestock supply, thus reduction of meat supply in the Lebanese market. So this will have a huge impact on the Lebanese food market. She said that the recent period, 70% of its vessels actually started calling alternative destinations than Beirut Port. So this led basically to a reduction of 70% of supply of livestock to the Lebanese market. Concerning basically what are her recommendations as a maritime consultant, she said that she believes there should be a coordination, as Dr. Jus said, between the government, between the intergovernmental agreements, and of course between the private sector, by imposing new set of regulations on the quality of vessels calling Beirut Port. For example, they should impose that only Ajax vessels should call Beirut Port. In this way, we would basically make our ports safer, because we are only accepting seaworthy vessels and good standard vessels calling the port. If we can manage to make our ports much safer, then we can make our country more secure. And finally, concerning the explosion, she said that it was cataclysmic and it has affected all ship owners when it comes to vessel maintenance and inspections and repairs. In addition to those two major big players in the Lebanese market, I have decided also to share the views of other parties that are operating on a daily basis at Beirut Port. This is the opinion of the owner of a clearance agent at Beirut Port. I would like to tackle the issue here that actually we do have a serious problems with the clearance system at Beirut Port. As the owner said, that the current system has many drawbacks. and that an efficient clearance system should actually prevent contact with human being, and this would lead to prevention of bribes, also prevention of corruption, reduction of corruption, and of course reduction of human error. We've been talking for years about full automation of the clearance system, but unfortunately up till today nothing is implemented. We will tackle this issue at the end of my presentation because this is one of the main problems and bottlenecks facing operation at Beirut port. Also, I added the view of also one of the main freight forwarding companies at Beirut port, who explained clearly that the port clearance system is not fully standardized as it should be. This would this wouldn't allow fair trade between investors, and of course there will be no equal opportunities between traders. In addition to that, I'm going to quote actually the Ship Agent Syndicate news. It was posted a few days ago on MTV News. They mentioned that they are facing serious threats that would become a misfortune. This is because of the continuous shutdown of the electricity at Beirut port. This would lead to serious damage to the reefer products that of course it's worth billions. And of course, this is the result of the poor infrastructure, the poor electricity, lots of electricity shortage, and fuel deficit, which of course create a bottleneck to the efficient transport operation system, and mainly to the reefer container terminal. Last but not least, I have decided also to share the view of a Lebanese citizen who has nothing to do with the port. He's just living beside the port, and he said, and it was very touching actually, when he explained that he used to believe that the port is a gateway for trade and it's a way to enjoy other countries' innovation. However, today he perceives the port as a door for illegal trade and is threatening his life, his family's life, his neighbor's life, his grandchildren's lives, and he doesn't feel safe and secure anymore living beside the port. So obviously, after actually sharing with you the views of the different players in the shipping market, of the citizens living beside the port, we can conclude that there's a serious impact, severe impact on Lebanon's economy, on even not only on the Lebanon's economy, also on the citizens, on the investors who lack trust in Beirut port governance, and they believe that it is not transparent at all. And I think this would really create serious missed opportunities in investment in the future and lack of developments. So the question now is, what is next? This is actually the challenge. What's going to happen next? Well, of course, we have to try to be optimistic as much as possible, and we have to consider the recommendations that should be done in the future in order to rebuild Beirut port. First of all, we have to consider a new governance structure. When we talk about a new governance structure, we should consider the public-private partnership, or PPP, or landlord port model, because it has proven to be very, very efficient. Also, we should consider new port authorities. We should consider the management protocols in the accounting and audit in order to increase accountability at the port. In addition to that, we should work on quality infrastructure. What I mean by that is a new landscape strategy, maybe a maritime cluster. We should integrate the port with the city. We should work on the basics infrastructure, maybe to rebuild Beirut port to become an inland port as it used to be before, and of course to become a hub, a main hub in the MENA region. We have to improve the layout of the port and optimize the land use. In addition to that, and this is a very important issue to tackle, because I work at Beirut port on a daily basis, and I believe that this is one of the main bottlenecks to efficient transportation, is the digitalization of the port. We should work on digitalizing the port. We should work on a modernized clearance system, adopting new custom laws, and working on a one head, one body organization. And finally, Of course, we should go for open and transparent bidding, and we should always disclose all sorts of information on all aspects of the contracting at Beirut Port. So finally, what is next? My opinion, the next step is to take action towards rebuilding a better Beirut port. Thank you, Arif, and thank you, audience.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Abi Khalil, for this heartening case study of maritime governance and corruption, focusing on the port of Beirut. I would now like to thank the presenters for their very valuable presentations and usher in the discussion period of this webinar. But before I do that, I would like to invite Ms. Maya At-Tayyara, head of the Maritime Training Division of the Ministry of Public Works and Transport in Lebanon, to deliver a message on behalf of the Directorate General of Land and Maritime Transport. Ms. At-Tayyara, may I ask you to activate your microphone and webcam? Okay, well, Ms. At-Tayyara is definitely with us, yes. I have a feeling she may take a few minutes to deliver her words. Oh, there you are, Maya. Welcome.
Hello, how are you? Hi, everybody.
Very well, thank you. We know you're in the middle of a meeting with international partners, yes, at the Ministry of Public Works and Transport. And I thought it would be wonderful if you could address the webinar on this important topic of Maritime Lebanon.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you.
Okay, I am here again.
So go ahead, Ms. At-Tayyara.
Okay, I would like in this minute to highlight another side of the maritime industry. I would like to introduce for you our only public maritime training institute, Marsati, as one attempt from the Directorate General of Land and Maritime Transport to make Lebanon a maritime hub for Mediterranean by providing high-level training for Lebanese and Arab seafarers working on board of commercial ships and yachts. And recently, launching online special courses related to maritime industry, presented by national maritime experts and targeting candidates from all over the world. Marsati is one of the many tools to implement the maritime policy, which includes enforcing safety, security measures, and ports and Lebanese flagged vessels. So protecting the marine environment and ascertaining environment-friendly practices in ships and ports operations, training and certification. Through Marsati, the Directorate General is providing the maritime sector with qualified seafarers, ports personnel, integrating regional and international policies by implementing international maritime conventions. On behalf of the Directorate General of Land and maritime transport. I would like to invite maritime private sector to share concerns and goals with the administration to put common plans and achievable targets along with the cooperation of other concerned ministries for the public benefit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tayara, for taking the time to address the webinar and for providing very important views on how your ministry sees the development of maritime education and training through its own institution at Marsati, which is located just north of the historic city of Byblos, or modern day Spain.
In Batroun, north of Lebanon and Batroun.
Thank you very much. So we can maybe now press on with the question. We've had a flow of very interesting questions from the audience. I'm going to try to take them in the order they relate to the various speakers, although some of the questions will probably be ably dealt with by more than one speaker. And if I may, I'm going to start off by picking on one question from Mr. Azou at the IMO. And the question is for WMU Vice President Schröder-Hinrichs. The question is as follows. Is there any role for the civil society in maritime administration, taking into account the increasing involvement of civil society in all aspects of governance? Is that
thank you for this question. I think this is a great question because this, I think, is an aspect that we might still not recognize so much. But if you think about the fact that the civil society is concerned, I think, as it is clearly seen here in this webinar, for instance, but this is not the only aspect in this. If you think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and if you think about especially, let's say, SDG 14, life below water, you see that the public at large is concerned about increasing pollution of the oceans. And many initiatives have been started by civil society, specifically focusing, for instance, at plastic in the oceans. If you think about all the different initiatives that have come up in recent years, mainly starting from private actor funding and then being taken up by individuals, then I would say that clearly manifests in a way the role that the public is playing. And it also demonstrates that governance in a way is a system where individual concerns will be articulated. And I think this is also reflected in this webinar here. We wouldn't have this webinar if the situation would be satisfying in relation to governance in Lebanon. So I think webinars like this, initiatives like this, pretty much reflect concerns that civil society has. This is part of governance where such concerns are presented. And then I think as part of governance, there should be a response and there should be a dialogue through which a new level of governance can emerge. And I think it is alerting in a way also when you hear in the presentation that was made by one of the presenters here that where the individual opinions were raised that, that there is not enough confidence in governance as such. I think this is an alerting signal. But I think in principle, yes, governance depends on the civil society, and the civil society is a fundamental part of governance. Without civil society, it doesn't work.
Thank you, Jens, for your answer to that question. We have, I think, another question which maybe before I ask Dr. Nader to chip in, perhaps Jens, you could partly address it, because It was also addressed, I think, to you, and it's on cybersecurity, a subject that Ms. Abi Khalil also touched on. The question from Mr. Azu at the IMO is, what are the implications of cybersecurity for shipping, especially in the age of artificial intelligence? Where do you situate cybersecurity in the maritime and shipping architecture?
Yeah, also this is a very good question. Thank you very much for this. Cybersecurity is a new challenge that we are facing. And I think it's not uncommon if we are looking back in more recent years in terms of developments at the IMO. Many new issues came up and needed a response from the international shipping community. And I think as far as cybersecurity is concerned, we can say that in today's world, where we are looking more and more at digitalization, cybersecurity really represents a significant challenge for that. Data exchange between ships and shore-based facilities require a high level of security. If you think about payments, for instance, you don't want to work with payment systems where, as a result of an insecure environment, the financial means will basically not be successful. So I would say cybersecurity will probably bring new actors and services to the table. I can only speculate specifically on how that will look like in the future. But if we are looking back at how the security topic in general emerged in the maritime context, and if we think about the ISPS code, it was clear that suddenly new agency, a completely new business is basically suddenly coming to the table. But also this is important as part of governance, because what I would say is, especially if we are looking at autonomous ships and how all of this develops, it is important that we find a way of integrating these new actors, because shipping is global. And I would say the secret to its success is that it has been possible to create one forum where all of this will be discussed, and that's the IMO. So I'm expecting that also as far as cybersecurity is concerned, that the IMO should take the lead and provide the global standards to the benefit of the maritime community.
Thank you, Jens, for these enlightening comments on that issue. May I proceed with some other questions that have been addressed to other speakers? Dr. Nader, if I could ask you to respond to a question that we received from one of the attendants, Frank Oehner. Professor Nader has shown all the regulations, but they do not work. See the wreckage in the port of Beirut. The wreck of the Orient Queen is still at the ground. He's referring actually to shipwrecks. So that question, I guess it's addressed to Professor Nader specifically.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. If you recall correctly, in one of my slides at the end, I said that with all of the strategies that we have, all of the laws that we put forward, there's been quite extensive work in terms of developing what needs to be developed. But we are in a huge impasse for the past 20 years in terms of governance. The government of Lebanon is completely devoid of any capacity to be able to take a decision and implement it. We know that we have all of these laws. More specifically, we've been working on conservation of the coastal area, not in a sustainable fashion, not conservation in terms of full protection. And you find that even the laws are on your side. When you go to try to push them forward and to implement them, there is always a loophole somewhere. And if it's not a loophole, it's just a flagrant breaking of the laws and non-implementation by government. And the impact that we've been seeing with our inability to form a government to address all of the challenges that we have, just I don't want to say trickles down as much as floods over all sectors that exist. So, of course, we are trying to do our work as scientists, as activists, as advocates of change. But knowing the political situation in Lebanon makes it almost impossible to implement the laws. We have a new proverb, let's say, that we say the problem in Lebanon is not the availability or the presence of laws, it is the implementation of the laws that we have that is creating the issues. So yes, I completely agree. In order to give you a solution for this, I guess we are hoping that we get rid of the current political body that exists, if I may. I don't want to go extremist here on in this workshop, but yeah, we need a complete change of the system of governance. And the explosion in Port Beirut is just a manifestation of the incompetence that exists in our government system. That's my point of view on a personal level, actually. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nader. There is a few other questions related to the status of the environment. But there is one question I think that follows directly from your presentation, which perhaps you should address, if at all possible. And the question is provided by Yarob Badr at UN ESQA. What is the status of the land under the Port of Beirut Authority? Who is the exact owner of this land?
According to our knowledge, and I always say according to our knowledge of Lebanon, because there's always a paper hidden somewhere in some drawer. But according to our knowledge, it is owned by the government of Lebanon, as all public lands like the airport, railroads, roads, etc. All of these are usually owned by the Lebanese government, and they are managed by some sorts of authorities. Currently, and I'm sure maybe Dr. Abi Khalil could also add to this since he's working on the port, but all of those are managed, like as we say, by some sort of authority, and we have the Beirut Port Authority that is responsible for the management of the port. But there are also a lot of other institutions with overlapping mandates. As I have stated, for the coastal zone, it's almost everywhere. The Lebanese army is responsible for some sort of security issues, the internal security forces for others. The Port Authority is not actually officially endorsed. Its nominations have been there, but it hasn't been published by a decree, if I'm not mistaken. So we go back to the complete lack of governance and our capability to govern our issues. But as the land itself, according to my knowledge and according to what I've seen in the papers, that is owned by the government of Lebanon, unless somebody has any other information that's not available to me. Thank you.
Dr. Arif, Dr. Manar, if I may add, yes, he's right. Actually, the land belongs to the government. However, it is not operated by the government. It is operated by a company named Gestion Exploitation du Port de Beirut. It is the company operating the port. And of course, there are different terminals at the port. There's actually the container terminal is operated by BCTC. However, the land itself belongs to the government.
Thank you both for your insights on that question of the land ownership. As I said, we got a few questions for Professor Nader on some of the scientific aspects of coastal zone management. And let me start with a question that we received from Mr. Amin Shaban of the National Council for Scientific Research in Lebanon. The question is specifically addressed to Professor Nader. You mentioned that erosion is a big issue along the Lebanese coast, and this is well pronounced at different shoreline stretches of Lebanon. However, a large part of our coastline has been lately owned by the private sector. Let's say actors or politically supported people where they apply different, I'm not censoring anything, by the way, where they apply different construction aspects and sea filling and other open business along the coastline. I'm wondering if these actors apply any protection measures or engineering controls to protect our coast and their properties from erosion.
All right, this is a big problem that we've been working on for a while. The thing is that today we have the degree for the environmental impact assessment. So any new project that needs to be constructed or is initiated on the coastal areas or even in maritime waters have to go through an EIA, which is great. I go back to the law, etc. It is great. But if we look at the way EIAs on coastal areas and maritime domains are being conducted, they are just being conducted in order for the permit to be issued versus for the protection or for the conservation of maritime resources. We work on EIAs, and usually if you want to carry out the proper EIA, you have to start assessing biodiversity and other things at least 1 year before to catch the different seasons and the different aspects of climate. And monitoring after project completion should go for another 3 years. These are new guidelines that we actually published with the Ministry of Environment, but they are still at the guideline level. On the other hand, in practicality, you find that an EIA for a project of, I don't know how many square meters with a marina, etc., in the marine environment is carried over a period of 2 days. Like you do a dive, you collect things, you analyze the sediments. It's just more of actually pretending that you carried the proper EIA versus the actual EIA the way it has to be done. And this solely falls, the responsibility falls on the Ministry of Environment by actually endorsing such EIAs and allowing projects to go ahead. On top of this, I would like to add something is that EIAs as well as environmental protection, even though it has gained grounds, is still not considered very important or it's not considered essential. In many cases, we find that the project construction, more specifically ports or marinas for government, they start work on them before even the EIA is conducted. We carried out a couple of EIAs where the actual jetty was almost completed before we were allowed on the site to sample what's going to happen to the area. So we go back to the issue of governance, we go back to lack of accountability, we go back to the fact that there is no transparency, and and since you're not censoring things, Dr. Fakhri, I think it's more like we're moving more towards a failed state than an actual state. So I don't know if I answered Dr. Shaban's question or not, but yes, it's not being done correctly. And this is the big problem. If EIAs were conducted the way they should be conducted, I'm sure we would be in a better shape at this stage.
Thank you, Professor Nada. I think it's high time that these matters were very much stated as they are. I have another question addressed to you from the same colleague at the National Council for Scientific Research. I realize that marine pollution is the major environmental threat along the maritime region of Lebanon that hits the entire marine ecosystem. Nevertheless, the existing laws and legislations are still ineffective, and only few concerns are given to this legal aspect. How can you justify that?
Well, one thing I want to say is that marine pollution is one of the major issues. What we consider as an equal or even a larger issue is the artificialization of the coast and the sea filling. We have a very, very narrow continental shelf. Our productive areas are in shallow waters. We all know that more than 90% of productivity of marine environments around the world are on continental shelves, basically. Since we have a narrow one, any type of damage to our continental shelf will exponentially affect our food security and biodiversity. So we have to actually address both. In terms of pollution, we are more into the organic and solid waste pollution than the actual chemical pollutants because we don't have much industrial activity, even though we say we have a lot of industries, but the industrial activity that we have is not as polluting as might people think. And organic pollution usually, if we want to say, gets broken down, which is sewage, etc., all of those things. and gets washed away and goes into the deep sea. But it is a fundamental problem, more specifically from solid waste management and wastewater perspective. On the other hand, why this is the case, it is a dysfunctional government. We go back to the same thing. I mean, we work on the coastal area. We have huge levels of corruption. We have huge levels of non-implementation of laws. We find that there's no accountability to the security forces to uphold the law. There is lack of material and human resources also to be able to do the controls that are needed, even though some efforts have been done, but they are circumventing everything. And since the Lebanese population to date hasn't actually held its politicians accountable in any way or form, it is a little bit difficult for the politicians themselves, I think, to go about applying the law. We're asking them to be ethical in an environment or a system that is completely based on nepotism and based on corruption. So for us, it always boils down to that. And we always say the laws are there. We don't need new laws at this stage. Let's implement what we have. Let's try to see if we implement them, what are the mistakes, what are the wrong things, what things need to be changed in order to reach a better, let's say, coastal area. I'll give you an example in fisheries. The fisheries law have been lagging for the past 4 or 5 years. On average, a law in Lebanon takes 7 years to get passed by parliament. So by the time the law is passed, you need to amend it because so much science has been pumped into it and so many things have changed that the law itself becomes obsolete by the time it is passed. So I don't know, that's the problem. Science is there, effort is being made, as you have seen in my presentation. The Ministry of Environment is actually doing its best within the political system. The people at the Ministry of Agriculture in terms of fisheries and management of marine resources are working extensively with the FAO in the Mediterranean, working with us, working with other scientific bodies. But it all stops when you get to the political level. And if we don't have political initiatives and ethical approaches to managing the small coastline, which is only 300 kilometers, it's not even a beach in other countries, we find ourselves in a quagmire. So it all boils down to that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Very satisfying answer to me, at least, in hitting the matter on its head. I have a question for our third speaker, Mrs. Abi Khalil, and the question goes as follows. It is actually originating from the ICMPD staff. 2 years since the same problems were addressed, is there a chance to rebuild the forums for representing interested parties to articulate better the needs so some basic fundamental reform can be initiated? And I think this question goes back in a way to the matter of stakeholders and civil society at large.
Well, I hope so. Actually, we don't want to speak. I don't want to give another speech about maritime governance after 2 years, and you know, we wouldn't move forward by then. But the thing is that, as we previously explained, that we need the coordination of different parties at the same time in order to reach a successful solution. Those parties are, first of all, the government, the governmental agencies, then the intergovernmental organizations such as IMO, ILO, and of course the shipping industry, the private sector, classification societies, etc. So at this point, I'm not sure. I would like to be very optimistic by saying yes, it can be done, but at this point, due to the situation in Lebanon and due to the non-availability, basically, of efficient government agencies, I'm not sure this would take place anytime soon. Especially that the thing is that norms are understood, rules and laws are there. However, it's not implemented. This is the main problem here. We do have the rules, we do have the regulations, we do have the norms, but the thing is that it is not well implemented.
Thank you, Mrs. Abi Khalil. We have 2 questions addressed to WMU Vice President Schröder Hinrichs. They're a bit long, so let me start with the first one that we received from an official of the Lebanese Ministry of the Interior. My question is addressed to Professor Schröder-Hinrichs. We see that IMO is always reacting to marine incidents and regulating accordingly. Moreover, the industry is pushing sometimes. Mass is given as an example. Looking to oil and gas sector, we still don't see an active role of the IMO concerning security. Just a recommendation in Part B of the ISPS code. Do we need another Deepwater Horizon with security ignition to start seeing the Maritime Safety Committee of the IMO to react? The lines of responsibilities, as mentioned, are still not clear. Over to you, Jens.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Thank you very much. Well, let me start with saying that I don't think that it is appropriate today to say that the IMO is reactive. I think the IMO has changed in recent years tremendously. And I think the discussion about maritime autonomous surface ships is, I think, a very strong indicator in this respect. This is technology that doesn't even exist, but the IMO is undergoing a regulatory scoping study at the moment in order to see how well IMO regulations would be able to capture this. And I think the work on the oceans that the IMO now also specifically does in terms of addressing emissions and so on, I think is another indicator that for a number of years the organization has been trying to work very proactive. That in a complex world we are also having occasional accidents is, I would say, the nature in any technical world. And I think it is also appropriate and necessary to respond to those accidents. But I think that the accidents today don't characterize the work of the IMO anymore, as it may have been in the case of the 1980s, for instance. When it comes to oil and gas in particular, I need to highlight that oil and gas is only covered to a very narrow part in IMO's mandate. I have in a study some years ago compared the oil and gas sector. This is why some of the numbers are still floating in my head with the shipping sector. And what we see is that shipping has developed so well with more than 50,000 ships governed by one set of regulations because there is one international organization that deals with this. When we are looking at the oil and gas sector, the only thing that's regulated by IMO instruments in the oil and gas sector is the mobile offshore drilling unit, the platform on which the equipment is installed before actually the operation is carried out. And only when that ship is, or this unit is moving, then it's considered sort of a ship. And that's when the construction regulations for such mobile offshore drilling units apply in this way. Once that unit arrives at the stage where it should carry out its operation, the equipment, the operational arrangements, and so on are not covered by IMO instruments, and that part of production is not part of IMO's mandate. So this is where you see the different responsibilities, and IMO doesn't have an opportunity of regulating that. If this wants to be changed, and I have to say that very carefully, I'm not speaking, of course, on behalf of the Secretariat of the IMO here. I'm just only highlighting the very hypothetical case. Let's say if member states want the IMO to regulate this, then they have to come to the Secretariat and discuss it with other member states, and then one would need to see if there's an extended mandate for the IMO. This would be the process. I can personally only say that there are many challenges for the Secretariat, and it's a relatively small Secretariat in a way for a relatively complex range of topics. So I think it is okay that the IMO, the Secretariat, is trying to focus on the core mandates as they have been addressed by or as they are basically outlined in the IMO convention, where the mandate is very much restricted to ships and not to oil and gas. But I think it's an interesting question, and one can certainly bring it up in context of a discussion about maritime and marine governance, because for many of the new actors in the oceans, anything that's related to blue economy, there is no international organization dealing with this. And I think, highlighting once more, the success of world shipping is that there was one organization dealing with the technical standards, and that has really helped the shipping sector to go up to that level where it is today. And I think some of the other sectors that are relatively new to oceans would maybe benefit from having one organization of a similar status and similar abilities and capabilities to help setting up global standards, because oceans don't stop at national borders. So this is something that's, of course, maybe also to consider. But I wouldn't dare to say that this is something that the IMO should take on. That's up to member states to decide. And also provide the financial means to an organization to do this.
Thank you for a very elaborate answer, Jens. And I should state for the record that we have a number of IMO staff in the audience. And it may be in point to mention that the IMO has two major instruments, the SUA Protocol of 1988 and their amendments of 2005. This message just came through from our colleagues of the IMO. Another question for Jens, coming from our colleague here at WMU, Dr. Hansa Lagdami, one of our prime researchers. Dr. Heinrich Schröder, how do you see a country like Lebanon getting prepared for all development in the port sector, like automation and digitalization, and taking the opportunity of its reconstruction as a first step? So this question kind of wraps up all the discussion we've been having.
Yeah, okay. If I can share my view there, not being too closely associated with Lebanon and the conditions there, I can refer back to some of the research that we have carried out at WMU in more recent years. We did a study on how we see transport or the transport sector in principle developing over the next almost 20 years and develop some kind of a forecast. And in this respect, we also looked at factors in general and developments that would facilitate or maybe hinder the development of automation and digitalization in the transport sector. One of the findings that I would like to highlight is that we had a concern about a growing gap between those countries leading in the uptake of automation and those countries who have not been able to participate at the moment with this. And there's a very dynamic development also in the port sector. So this is something that we see with a concern, because it would require in different countries to spot at a relatively early stage that this is a development, and it would require that those countries are making conscious decisions about how they can facilitate automation and digitalization and what they can do within the different actors in the maritime sector to support this. We have looked at different factors there that would facilitate the development of digitalization and research. And what I can say, of course, maybe in the context also of Lebanon, I would like to highlight it is not only the technical feasibility, whether one can in the port, for instance, install highly automated equipment. It would also require regulations that are there and that they work. It would also require a skilled and motivated labor force that's able to operate this automation. And that normally requires that there is also a strong education and research sector behind this in the country that would facilitate such a development. And I think one of the very important aspects in this is there has to be a business model for this. And that basically means there has to be confidence by investors to go to that particular location and invest. So I would say maybe these are factors that will determine to which extent any country, including Lebanon, will be able to deliver on this trend and take that into consideration.
Thank you very much, Jens, and all my esteemed speakers. Unless there are any additional questions that I may have missed, we can probably now wrap up the webinar. I would like to, of course, mention that this webinar has tackled the different aspects of the redevelopment of Lebanon's maritime outlook. Some of the takeaways: maritime and marine governance are both important. International actors need to be engaged with. Civil society and socio-economic stakeholders need to be engaged with. We do not need new laws. The laws in place need to be implemented. The shipping sector is reeling and in need of support and should actually itself capitalize on its role in maritime governance. Let me also state there that this webinar is the first in a series that will tackle different aspects of the redevelopment of Lebanon's maritime outlook. The webinar was recorded, and we will be sharing the link to the recording once it's ready. Presentations will also be shared. So again, a big thank you to the speakers, the organizers, and the audience. And I think we can conclude this webinar at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Bye.